I never thought my simple evening routine of lighting my wood stove would land me in the middle of a legal nightmare. But that's exactly what happened when Margaret Peterson, president of our Willow Creek Homeowners Association in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, decided my firewood smoke was an environmental hazard to the entire neighborhood. It started on a Wednesday evening in late January 2025, when the temperature had dropped to 8 degrees below zero, and I was settling in for a quiet night at home. I had just loaded a few splits of seasoned oak into my cast iron wood stove when I heard the aggressive pounding on my front door. The kind of knocking that makes you think someone's either being chased or extremely angry. In Margaret's case, it was definitely the latter. I opened the door to find her standing there, wrapped in what looked like 3 different coats, her face red from either the cold or rage. Probably both. "Jeremy Carson, what do you think you are doing?" she demanded, pushing past me into my living room without waiting for an invitation. "I'm heating my house, Margaret. Same as I do every winter," I said, closing the door behind her to keep the cold air out. "That smoke coming from your chimney is polluting the entire neighborhood. I can smell it from 4 houses away. It's triggering my asthma and probably giving everyone else respiratory problems too." I looked at her skeptically. "You've lived here for 8 years. I've been burning wood for heat every winter since I bought this place 6 years ago. This is the first time you've ever complained about it." "Well, I'm complaining now. And as HOA president, I'm telling you to stop immediately. We have air quality standards to maintain in this community." "Show me the covenant that says I can't burn wood," I challenged. She pulled out her phone and started scrolling through something with exaggerated movements. "Right here in Section 12, subsection 4. It says all homeowners must maintain reasonable standards of air quality and not create nuisances that affect neighboring properties." "That's incredibly vague, Margaret. That could mean anything from not burning trash to not overcooking fish. It doesn't specifically ban wood burning." "I'm calling an emergency board meeting for this Saturday. We're going to address this issue properly. Until then, I expect you to stop burning wood immediately. I'm not going to freeze in my own home because you've suddenly developed a problem with something I've been doing for years." Margaret's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "This is exactly the kind of selfish attitude that ruins communities. You're poisoning the air we all breathe, and you don't even care." "I care about not freezing to death and keeping my heating bills reasonable. My gas furnace is expensive to run, Margaret. The wood stove supplements it and saves me about $200 a month during winter." "Well, maybe you should have thought about that before buying a house in a community with standards," she snapped, turning on her heel and marching toward the door. "Saturday at 10 in the morning at the community center. Don't be late." She slammed the door so hard that a picture frame on the nearby wall rattled. I stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. Then I went back to my wood stove, added another log, and decided I needed to do some research on HOA rules and Iowa state law regarding home heating methods. The rest of that week passed with an unusual tension in the neighborhood. I noticed Margaret had been making the rounds, going door to door, presumably rallying support for her crusade against my wood stove. I saw her talking animatedly with several neighbors, gesturing toward my house, her breath visible in the frigid air. On Friday, I received an official-looking letter in my mailbox. It was from the Willow Creek HOA board, formally notifying me of the emergency meeting and stating that the agenda included discussion and potential prohibition of wood-burning appliances within the community due to air quality concerns. I spent Friday evening reading through every page of the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions. The document was 73 pages long and had been written in 1998 when the subdivision was first developed. I found the section Margaret had referenced, and she was technically correct that it mentioned maintaining air quality and not creating nuisances. However, it was clearly intended to prevent things like burning trash, leaving rotting garbage around, or other genuinely offensive activities. There was nothing specific about wood stoves or fireplaces. I also discovered something interesting in Section 28. Any modification to the covenants required a vote of at least 60% of all homeowners, and any new rule had to be consistent with state and local regulations. This gave me an idea. Saturday morning arrived with more bitter cold. The forecast showed we were in for another week of below zero temperatures at night. I dressed warmly and walked to the community center at the entrance of our subdivision. The building was a modest structure used for neighborhood gatherings, and I could see several cars already parked outside. Inside, Margaret had arranged folding chairs in rows facing a table where she sat with the other two board members, Richard Thompson, the vice president, and Susan Martinez, the secretary. About 15 neighbors had shown up, which was actually a pretty good turnout for our subdivision of 42 homes. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Margaret began, standing up and clasping her hands together. "We have a serious environmental issue that needs immediate attention. As many of you know, Jeremy Carson has been operating a wood-burning stove that's releasing harmful smoke into our neighborhood." "I'm heating my home, Margaret," I interrupted from my seat in the back row. "You're polluting our air," she countered. "Several neighbors have complained about the smoke smell and the potential health effects. Who specifically has complained?" I asked, looking around the room. "Besides you, I mean." There was an awkward silence. Finally, Patricia Adams, who lived 2 doors down from Margaret, raised her hand tentatively. "I've noticed the smoke smell sometimes when I'm walking my dog in the evening." "Does it bother you?" I asked directly. She hesitated. "Well, it's noticeable. I wouldn't say it bothers me exactly." "Anyone else?" I looked around the room. No other hands went up. Margaret's face was reddening again. "Just because people haven't formally complained doesn't mean it's not a problem. Wood smoke contains particulate matter, carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds, and other harmful pollutants. This is a documented fact. So do gas furnaces," I pointed out. "So do cars. So does the chemical plant 15 miles east of here." "We're not here to discuss other pollution sources," Margaret said sharply. "We're here to address your wood burning. I'm proposing that the board pass a rule immediately prohibiting the use of wood-burning appliances for heating purposes within the community." Richard Thompson cleared his throat. He was a retired engineer, probably in his mid-60s, and generally seemed more reasonable than Margaret. "I'm not sure we can just pass a rule like that without proper notice and a vote. The covenants are pretty specific about the amendment process." "This isn't an amendment," Margaret argued. "This is simply enforcement of our existing air quality standards." "But the existing language doesn't specifically address wood burning," Susan Martinez pointed out. She was younger than the other board members, maybe early 40s, and I'd always found her to be fair in her decisions. "It addresses nuisances and air quality." "Wood smoke clearly falls under that category," Margaret insisted. I stood up. "I'd like to propose an alternative solution. Before we make any decisions about banning wood burning, why don't we actually measure the air quality? Let's get objective data instead of relying on subjective complaints and assumptions." "That's not necessary," Margaret said quickly. "We already know wood smoke is harmful, but we don't know how much smoke I'm actually producing or how it compares to other sources," I continued. "If we're going to make rules based on air quality concerns, Shouldn't we actually test the air quality? Richard nodded slowly. That's actually not a bad idea. It would give us solid information to base any decisions on. I agree, Susan said. We should have data before implementing something this significant. Margaret looked frustrated, but she couldn't really argue against the logic. Fine, but I want this resolved quickly. How do we even test air quality? There are environmental testing companies that specialize in this, I said. I'd actually looked this up on Friday night. We can hire one to do measurements around the neighborhood, test outside my house when the wood stove is running, and get a proper assessment. And who's paying for this? Margaret demanded. The HOA has a reserve fund for exactly these kinds of situations, Richard said, looking at Susan for confirmation. She nodded. We have about $12,000 in reserves. Air quality testing shouldn't be too expensive. Fine, Margaret said, clearly unhappy with this development. But once the results show what I already know, that wood smoke is a problem, then we implement the ban immediately. Agreed. If the results show my wood burning is creating an actual air quality problem, then yes, we can discuss restrictions, I said carefully. But if the results show it's not a significant issue, then I continue heating my home the way I have been. The board members conferred briefly and then agreed to the testing plan. Susan volunteered to research environmental testing companies and get quotes. The meeting adjourned with an agreement to reconvene once we had test results. As everyone filed out, I noticed Patricia Adams approach me. I hope you know I wasn't trying to cause problems for you, she said quietly. Margaret asked me directly if I'd ever smelled smoke from your house, and I couldn't lie. It's fine, Patricia. I appreciate your honesty. The smoke is real, I'm not denying that. I just don't think it's the environmental catastrophe Margaret's making it out to be. Between you and me, she said, glancing around to make sure Margaret wasn't nearby, I think she's just looking for something to complain about. She tried to fine me last summer for having my garbage cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours after trash pickup. I laughed. Sounds about right. Over the next few days, Susan worked on finding an air quality testing company. She called me on Tuesday evening with an update. I've got quotes from 3 different companies. The most affordable one is Midwest Environmental Solutions out of Des Moines. They can do a comprehensive air quality analysis for $800. That includes measuring particulate matter, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, volatile organic compounds, and several other pollutants at multiple locations around the neighborhood. That sounds reasonable. What's the timeline? They can be here this Thursday if we confirm by tomorrow. They'll set up monitoring equipment in the morning and collect data over a 24-hour period. Perfect. The forecast shows cold weather continuing, so I'll definitely be running the wood stove. That'll give them accurate data for what Margaret's complaining about. I'll confirm with them tomorrow then. I'm also going to ask them to test near a few other houses too, just to get baseline readings from different areas of the neighborhood. Smart thinking, Susan. On Thursday, a van from Midwest Environmental Solutions arrived at 9 in the morning. 2 technicians, both young men who looked like they were fresh out of college, began setting up sophisticated monitoring equipment at various locations. They placed one set of sensors on a tripod in my front yard, about 20 feet from my house. Another went in Margaret's front yard, and 3 more were distributed around the neighborhood. I met with the lead technician, whose name tag identified him as David, and explained the situation. So the HOA president thinks your wood stove is creating an air quality problem, he asked, making notes on his tablet. That's right. I burned seasoned hardwood, mostly oak and ash, in a modern EPA-certified wood stove. I've been doing it every winter for 6 years without any complaints until last week. And you're burning today. I'll have it going most of the day and evening since it's so cold. That should give you plenty of data. Perfect. We'll collect measurements continuously until tomorrow morning at 9. Then we'll need a day or two to analyze everything and prepare a report. Margaret came outside while the technicians were still setting up equipment in her yard. She was wearing a heavy coat and had her arms crossed, watching them work with an expression that suggested she was already planning her victory speech. "Make sure you get accurate readings," she told David. "I want documentation of exactly how much pollution that wood smoke is producing." "We'll get accurate readings of all air quality parameters at all monitoring locations, madam," David replied professionally. "The equipment doesn't have any bias. It just measures what's actually in the air." "Good, because I'm certain the results will show a significant problem." I went back inside and went about my normal routine. I loaded the wood stove mid-morning, added more wood around lunchtime, and again in the late afternoon. The temperature outside hovered around 12 degrees, so the wood stove was definitely working hard to supplement the furnace. That evening, I noticed Margaret standing on her front porch multiple times, looking toward my house where thin wisps of smoke rose from the chimney. She had her phone out and appeared to be taking pictures or videos. I wondered if she was documenting evidence for some elaborate presentation she was planning. The next morning, the technicians returned to collect their equipment. I went outside to talk with David while he was packing up the sensors from my yard. "Get everything you needed?" I asked. "Yep, good data collection. We had clean readings throughout the monitoring period. Should have a report ready by Monday." "Any preliminary observations?" He glanced around, then spoke quietly. "I'm not supposed to comment before the official report is ready, but I will say your wood smoke isn't registering as dramatically as some people might expect. We've done testing near industrial wood burners and old, inefficient stoves, and those show much higher readings. Your equipment seems pretty clean burning. That's because it's an EPA-certified stove, and I only burn properly seasoned wood. Makes a big difference." "Definitely does. Anyway, we'll have the full data analysis completed early next week." Margaret was outside again, watching the equipment removal with the intensity of a hawk watching a field mouse. As soon as the technicians drove away, she walked directly to my house. "Don't think you've won anything," she said before I could even greet her. "Once that report shows the pollution levels, we're implementing the ban." "Margaret, what do you have against my wood stove? Seriously. You've never complained about this before. What changed?" She crossed her arms. "I've been educating myself about environmental issues. I learned about the harmful effects of wood smoke, and I realized we have a problem right here in our own neighborhood. I'm trying to protect people's health. Or you're trying to find something to exercise your authority over. You love being in control, Margaret. Admit it." Her face flushed. "How dare you? I volunteer my time to serve this community. I work hard to maintain our property values and quality of life." "You work hard to tell people what to do," I corrected. "There's a difference." She turned and stormed off without another word. I probably shouldn't have provoked her, but her self-righteousness was getting exhausting. The weekend passed slowly. I kept burning wood because I needed to heat my house, and also because Margaret's demands that I stop had made me stubbornly determined to continue. I knew that was perhaps not the most mature reaction, but something about her authoritarian approach brought out my rebellious side. Monday afternoon, Susan called me. "The report just came in from Midwest Environmental Solutions. Can you come to my house? I think you'll want to see this before we share it with Margaret and Richard." I walked over to Susan's house, which was on the other side of the subdivision from both my place and Margaret's. She invited me into her kitchen and opened her laptop on the table. "Okay, so I've been reading through this report, and it's very interesting," she said, turning the screen so I could see it. "The data shows your wood smoke is definitely detectable, but the pollution levels are well within acceptable standards set by the EPA and Iowa Department of Natural Resources. So I'm not creating an air quality crisis. Not even close. The particulate matter readings near your house averaged 15 micrograms per cubic meter during the monitoring period. The EPA's standard for acceptable 24-hour exposure is 35 micrograms per cubic meter. You're less than half the threshold." I felt a wave of relief. "That's great news." "But wait, there's more," Susan said, scrolling down to another section of the report. "This is the really interesting part. Remember, they also put monitors at several other locations, including Margaret's house." "Yeah." "Well, the particulate matter reading near Margaret's house was actually higher than near yours. 22 micrograms per cubic meter." I stared at the screen. "How is that possible? She doesn't have a wood stove." "The report addresses that. See this section here." She pointed to a paragraph explaining the findings. They noted that Margaret's house has an older gas furnace with the exhaust vent on the side of the house. The wind patterns during the monitoring period caused the exhaust to circulate around her property rather than dispersing upward. The combustion byproducts from the gas furnace were actually creating more localized air pollution than your wood smoke. I started laughing. I couldn't help it. "You're telling me that Margaret's own heating system is polluting the air more than my wood stove?" "According to this data, yes. And it gets even better. Look at the breakdown of different pollutants." She scrolled to a detailed table showing measurements of various compounds. The wood smoke showed higher levels of certain particulates, but Margaret's gas furnace exhaust showed elevated levels of nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and several other combustion byproducts. The report specifically notes that the gas furnace is producing more nitrogen dioxide than the wood burning, and nitrogen dioxide is a significant respiratory irritant, more so than the type of particulates from clean burning wood. "This is unbelievable," I said. She started this whole crusade claiming my smoke was triggering her asthma, but her own furnace is actually creating more respiratory irritants. The report recommends that if anyone needs to make modifications for air quality concerns, it would be relocating or extending the exhaust vent on Margaret's furnace so it disperses more effectively. I sat back in my chair, processing this information. "How do you think she's going to react when she sees this?" Susan closed her laptop and sighed. "Not well. Margaret doesn't handle being wrong very gracefully. When are you sharing the report with her and Richard?" "I sent it to both of them about an hour ago." "I wanted to talk to you first since you're the one who's been under attack." Richard emailed back saying he'd read it and thought it was very informative. Margaret hasn't responded yet. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Susan's phone rang. The caller ID showed Margaret's number. "Speak of the devil," Susan said, answering the call on speaker. "Hi, Margaret. This report is completely wrong." Margaret's voice came through, sharp and agitated. "There's no way my furnace is creating more pollution than Jeremy's wood burning. This company is either incompetent or he somehow bribed them." "Margaret, they're a professional environmental testing firm," Susan said calmly. "They have no reason to produce inaccurate results. They used calibrated equipment and followed standard protocols. I don't care. These results don't make sense. Wood smoke is obviously worse than natural gas. Everyone knows that. Actually, the report explains exactly why the readings are what they are," Susan said. It's not about which fuel is inherently better or worse. It's about how efficiently it's being burned and how the exhaust is being dispersed. Jeremy has a modern EPA-certified stove that burns very efficiently. Your furnace is older, and the exhaust vent placement is creating localized concentration of pollutants. So now you're taking his side. Margaret's voice rose. This is ridiculous. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow evening. We need to discuss this. Margaret, the report clearly shows that Jeremy's wood burning is not creating an air quality problem. It's within all acceptable standards. I don't care what that report says. We're having a meeting. She hung up without saying goodbye. Susan and I looked at each other. Well, this should be interesting, I said. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Tuesday evening at 7. This time, even more neighbors showed up, word having spread about the air quality test results. The community center was nearly full, with at least 25 people present. Margaret sat at the front table with Richard and Susan, and she did not look happy. Her face was set in a tight expression, and she had several printed pages in front of her that she kept rearranging nervously. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "We're here to discuss the air quality test results and determine next steps regarding Jeremy Carson's wood burning." "The results seem pretty clear to me," Richard said, looking at his own copy of the report. "Jeremy's wood stove is operating well within acceptable standards. In fact, the air quality near his house is better than near several other locations we tested." "I disagree with the interpretation of these results," Margaret insisted. "Just because something meets minimum standards doesn't mean it's not a problem. We should be striving for the highest possible air quality, not just barely acceptable levels. By that logic, we should ban gas furnaces too," I pointed out from my seat, "since your furnace is apparently creating more pollution than my wood stove." The room got very quiet. Several people looked at Margaret with surprise, clearly not having heard this detail yet. "That's a completely different situation," Margaret stammered. "Everyone needs a furnace. Wood burning is optional." "Actually, for me it's not optional," I said. "It's how I afford to heat my house. Running the gas furnace alone would cost me about $500 a month in the winter. By supplementing with wood heat, I keep it around $300. That $200 difference matters to me." Patricia Adams raised her hand. "Can I ask a question? If Jeremy's wood burning is within EPA standards and actually measuring cleaner than some other sources, what exactly is the problem we're trying to solve?" "The problem is that wood smoke is unpleasant and potentially harmful," Margaret said. "But the data shows it's not harmful at the levels he's producing," Richard interjected. "Look, I understand you find the smoke smell objectionable, Margaret. That's a personal preference. But we can't ban something that's legal, within all standards, and not actually creating a health hazard just because one person doesn't like it." "I'm not the only person who has concerns," Margaret protested, though she couldn't point to anyone else who'd actually complained. Susan spoke up. "I think what the report tells us is that we don't have an air quality crisis in our neighborhood. All the readings, including near Jeremy's house, were well within acceptable ranges. The recommendations in the report suggest that if anyone needs to make modifications, it would be improving exhaust dispersion for some of the older gas furnaces, including yours, Margaret." "So you're saying I need to modify my furnace, but Jeremy doesn't need to stop burning wood?" "That's completely backwards. No one needs to do anything," Susan clarified. "The report says current air quality is acceptable. It just notes that your furnace exhaust could be improved if you wanted to reduce localized concentration of pollutants. It's a suggestion, not a requirement." "This is unacceptable," Margaret said, her voice rising. I started this process because of a legitimate concern about air quality. The fact that the report didn't reach the conclusion I expected doesn't mean we should ignore the issue. But there is no issue, Richard said, his patience clearly wearing thin. The professional testing showed no issue. Jeremy is doing nothing wrong. I move that we close this matter and take no further action. I second that motion, Susan said quickly. I oppose, Margaret stated. The motion carries 2-1, Richard announced. Jeremy, you're free to continue using your wood stove. Margaret, this matter is closed. Margaret stood up abruptly, gathering her papers. This is not over. If the board won't protect this community, I'll find another way. She walked out of the meeting, leaving Richard and Susan looking uncomfortable. Sorry about that, Jeremy, Richard said. For what it's worth, I think you've handled this situation very reasonably. Thanks, Richard. I appreciate you and Susan being objective about this. The meeting adjourned, and several neighbors came up to me to express their support. A few mentioned they'd been worried Margaret was going to start targeting their own minor covenant violations if she'd succeeded in banning my wood burning. It seemed her authoritarian approach had been rubbing people the wrong way for a while. I walked home feeling vindicated but also slightly concerned about Margaret's parting comment. She didn't seem like the type to let things go gracefully. My concern proved justified the following week. On Monday, I received a certified letter from someone named Donald Kramer, attorney at law, representing the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. The letter stated that despite the air quality test results, the HOA board had determined that wood burning constituted a nuisance under the covenant provisions, and ordered me to cease all wood burning immediately or face fines of $100 per day. I immediately called Susan. Did you know Margaret was sending me a legal demand letter? What? No, the board voted to close the matter. What does the letter say? I read it to her. She was silent for a moment, then said, This is not legitimate. The board voted 2-1 to take no action. Margaret doesn't have authority to send legal demands on behalf of the HOA without board approval. The letter says it's from the HOA board, not just from Margaret personally. She's misrepresenting the board's position. This is a serious problem. Let me talk to Richard and call you back. 20 minutes later, Susan called back. Richard is furious. He's drafting a letter to send to you and to this attorney stating that Margaret acted without board authorization. We're also calling an emergency meeting to address her conduct. The emergency board meeting happened on Wednesday evening. This one wasn't open to general members. It was specifically to address Margaret's unauthorized actions. However, word had spread, and several neighbors, including myself, showed up and were allowed to observe. Richard opened the meeting with barely controlled anger. Margaret, can you explain why you sent a legal demand letter to Jeremy using the HOA's name without board approval? I was acting in the best interests of the community, Margaret said defensively. You and Susan were refusing to take appropriate action, so I did. You don't have the authority to do that, Susan said. All board actions require a vote. You can't unilaterally make legal demands on behalf of the HOA. I'm the president. I have the authority to act when the board is deadlocked or failing to act. That's not how it works, Richard said, pulling out a copy of the HOA bylaws. Section 7 specifically states that the president has administrative authority to implement board decisions, but cannot make new policy decisions without a vote. You violated the bylaws. I also want to know where you got the money to hire an attorney, Susan added. I manage the HOA finances, and I didn't approve any payment to Donald Kramer. Margaret shifted uncomfortably. I haven't paid him yet. He's a friend who agreed to send the letter as a favor. I was going to request reimbursement after the matter was resolved. So you were planning to use HOA funds to pay for legal action that the board didn't approve? Richard's voice was incredulous. I was trying to protect the community, Margaret repeated stubbornly. By abusing your position and misrepresenting the board's decisions, Richard said. Margaret, I'm making a motion to remove you as HOA president effective immediately for exceeding your authority and misusing your position. You can't do that, Margaret sputtered. I was elected. The bylaws allow for removal of officers by a 2/3 vote of the board for cause, Susan said. This absolutely qualifies as cause. I second Richard's motion, Susan added. This is ridiculous. I'm the only one who actually cares about maintaining standards in this community. You're both too weak to make the hard decisions. The vote is 2 in favor of removal, 1 opposed, Richard announced. Margaret, you're no longer HOA president. Please return all HOA documents, keys, and files to Susan by this weekend. Margaret stood up, her face red with anger and humiliation. Fine. You know what? I'm glad to be done with this thankless job. This community deserves whatever decline it gets without my leadership. She grabbed her purse and stormed out for what was becoming a familiar, dramatic exit. After she left, Richard looked at me. Jeremy, on behalf of the board, I apologize for this entire mess. Margaret's letter to you is not a valid HOA action. You're free to continue using your wood stove without any restrictions or fines. I appreciate that, Richard, and I'm sorry this caused so much trouble for you and Susan. Not your fault, Susan said. Margaret's been gradually getting more controlling over the past year. This situation just brought it to a head. What happens now with the board? I asked. Do you need a new president? We'll hold a special election in the next month. In the meantime, Richard and I can handle the basic administrative duties. I left the meeting feeling relieved that the situation seemed to be resolved. Margaret had overplayed her hand, and it had cost her the position she'd clearly enjoyed wielding power from. For about a week, things were quiet. I continued burning wood without any issues. The weather remained cold, and my wood stove kept my house comfortably warm while keeping my utility bills manageable. Then things took a bizarre turn. On the following Thursday evening, I came home from work to find 2 police cars parked in front of my house. 2 Cedar Rapids police officers were standing on my front porch, and they turned as I approached. Jeremy Carson, one of them asked. Yes, that's me. What's going on? We received a complaint about illegal burning on your property. Mind if we take a look? Illegal burning? I have a wood stove. It's completely legal. The complaint specifically mentioned burning prohibited materials and creating a public health hazard, the other officer said, reading from a small notebook. Let me guess, I said, feeling my anger rising. This complaint came from Margaret Peterson. We're not at liberty to say who filed the complaint, sir. Can we inspect your property? I led them inside and showed them my wood stove. I opened the door so they could see the burning wood inside. As you can see, I'm burning firewood, seasoned oak and ash, nothing else. This is an EPA-certified stove. Everything is completely legal. The officers examined the stove, looked around my house, and even checked my woodpile outside. They found exactly what I'd told them: regular firewood and a properly installed, legal wood stove. Everything looks in order here, the first officer said. We'll note that in our report. Can I ask what specifically the complaint alleged? Because this is the second time this person has harassed me over my wood burning. The officer consulted his notebook again. The complaint stated you were burning household trash, possibly plastics and treated wood, creating toxic smoke. That's a complete lie. As you can see, I burn only natural wood. We can see that now, yes. Sorry to bother you, Mr. Carson. After the police left, I immediately called Susan and told her what had happened. She filed a false police report. Susan sounded shocked. That's illegal. I know, and I'm done being nice about this. Margaret is harassing me and it needs to stop. What are you going to do? I'm going to talk to a lawyer. If Margaret wants to play legal games, I'll play back. The next day, I took a long lunch break and visited Thompson and Associates, a local law firm that handled civil matters. I met with an attorney named Jennifer Thompson, no relation to Richard from my HOA. I explained the entire situation, from Margaret's initial complaint through the air quality testing, her unauthorized legal letter, her removal from the board, and finally the false police report. Jennifer listened carefully, taking notes. You have documentation of all this. I have the air quality report, the letter from Margaret's attorney friend, emails from the HOA board, and I can get the police report from last night. This is a clear case of harassment, Jennifer said. We can send a cease and desist letter demanding that Margaret stop all contact with you and stop filing false complaints. If she continues after that, we can pursue a restraining order and potentially sue for harassment. How much is this going to cost me? For a cease and desist letter, about $500. If we need to file for a restraining order or pursue a lawsuit, costs would increase. But honestly, a strongly worded cease and desist from an attorney often resolves these situations. Most people don't want the legal headache. Let's start with the cease and desist then. Jennifer drafted the letter that afternoon. It detailed Margaret's pattern of harassment, noted that her conduct was illegal and potentially criminal, and demanded that she immediately cease all contact with me, stop filing false reports, and refrain from any further interference with my legal use of my property. The letter warned that continued harassment would result in legal action, including a restraining order and a civil lawsuit for damages. The letter was sent by certified mail on Monday. Margaret signed for it on Tuesday afternoon. I know because Jennifer's office tracked the delivery and called to confirm. For 2 days, nothing happened. I began to hope that the legal letter had finally gotten through to Margaret and she'd back off. Then on Friday evening, I discovered someone had filed a complaint with the Cedar Rapids Building Department claiming I'd installed my wood stove without the proper permits. A building inspector showed up on Saturday morning asking to see my installation permits. Fortunately, I had them. When I'd had the stove installed 6 years ago, I'd hired a professional company that pulled all the required permits and had everything inspected. I showed the building inspector my documentation. Everything looks in order, he said. Sorry you had to deal with this. Unfortunately, we're required to investigate all complaints we receive. I understand. Can you tell me who filed the complaint? Sorry, complainants can be anonymous. Even when the complaint is false, he shrugged sympathetically. Unfortunately, yes. But I'll note in my report that the installation is fully permitted and compliant with all codes. I called Jennifer immediately after the inspector left. Margaret filed another false complaint, this time with the building department, even after receiving the cease and desist letter. Apparently, it didn't deter her. Okay, that changes things. She's now violated the cease and desist, which strengthens our position considerably. I'm going to draft a petition for a restraining order. We'll also pursue a civil harassment lawsuit. Margaret's conduct has crossed the line from annoying to illegal. How long does the restraining order process take? We can file for a temporary order immediately, which can be granted within a few days if the judge agrees there's a threat. Then there's a hearing for a permanent order within a couple weeks. Let's do it. Jennifer filed the petition on Monday morning. The petition detailed every incident: Margaret's initial complaint, the air quality testing that proved her wrong, her unauthorized legal letter, her false police report about illegal burning, and finally, the false building department complaint. It argued that Margaret was engaged in a sustained campaign of harassment that needed to stop. The judge granted a temporary restraining order on Wednesday. Margaret was legally required to stay away from me and stop filing any complaints or reports about me. The order was served to her that afternoon. I thought that would be the end of it. I really did. But Margaret, it turned out, was not done. On Thursday evening, I got a call from Richard. "Jeremy, have you been on the neighborhood Facebook group today?" "No, why?" "Margaret posted a long rant about you. She's claiming you're a dangerous polluter who bribed the testing company and manipulated the HOA board. She's calling for neighbors to file complaints with every city department to force action against you." I pulled up the Facebook group on my phone. Sure enough, Margaret had posted a lengthy diatribe that was part conspiracy theory and part character assassination. She claimed I was endangering everyone's health, that I'd somehow corrupted the air quality testing, that I'd turned the board against her, and that she was the only one brave enough to stand up for the community. She ended by providing contact information for various city departments and urging neighbors to file complaints. The post had been up for about 3 hours and had generated dozens of comments. To my relief, most of the comments were critical of Margaret, not supportive. Several neighbors pointed out that the professional testing had shown no problem. A few noted that Margaret had been removed from the board for exceeding her authority. One person bluntly stated that Margaret was harassing me and should stop. But a few comments were supportive of Margaret, calling me selfish and saying wood burning should be banned regardless of what testing showed. One person, someone named Robert Mitchell, who I didn't recognize, said he'd been suffering from breathing problems since I started burning wood and would be filing complaints with the health department. I screenshot everything and sent it to Jennifer. She called me back within an hour. "This post violates the restraining order. She's not supposed to have any contact with you, which includes posting about you on social media. She's also potentially defaming you with false statements. And encouraging others to file false complaints could be considered conspiracy or harassment by proxy. We need to inform the court immediately. What happens now? We file a motion for contempt. The judge can impose penalties, extend the restraining order, or even jail time for violating a court order. We also need to bring this up at the hearing for the permanent restraining order, which is scheduled for next Tuesday." That weekend, 3 different city departments received complaints about my wood burning: the health department, the fire department, and the environmental services division. All 3 sent inspectors or investigators to my house. All 3 found nothing wrong. My wood stove was legal, properly installed, and not creating any actual health or safety hazards. Each inspector mentioned they'd received multiple complaints, which told me that Margaret's Facebook post had generated the desired response, at least from a few people. Jennifer filed the contempt motion on Monday. The hearing for the permanent restraining order was Tuesday afternoon. I took the afternoon off work to attend. Margaret showed up with the attorney friend who'd sent the earlier letter, Donald Kramer. He looked uncomfortable, probably realizing he'd gotten involved in a situation that had spiraled out of control. The judge, a stern-looking woman named Judge Patricia Anderson, reviewed all the documentation Jennifer had submitted. This included the air quality report, the HOA correspondence, police reports, building inspector reports, screenshots of Margaret's Facebook post, and evidence of all the complaints filed with various city departments. Mrs. Peterson, Judge Anderson said, looking over her glasses at Margaret. Do you dispute that you wrote this Facebook post? No, Your Honor, I wrote it, but I have freedom of speech. I'm entitled to express my concerns about a legitimate community issue. Freedom of speech doesn't extend to defamatory statements or to violating court orders. You were served with a temporary restraining order on Wednesday. This post was made on Thursday. You were explicitly ordered to have no contact with Mr. Carson. I didn't contact him directly. I posted on a community forum about a community issue. You posted specifically about Mr. Carson, using his name, making false allegations, and encouraging others to file complaints against him. That constitutes indirect contact and harassment. Donald Kramer cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may, Mrs. Peterson was acting out of genuine concern for neighborhood air quality. Judge Anderson fixed him with a stern look. Counselor, her concerns were investigated by professional environmental testers who found no issue. They were reviewed by building inspectors, fire marshals, health department officials, and police officers, all of whom found no violations. At what point does concern become harassment? She feels strongly that wood burning is dangerous regardless of what testing shows. Her feelings don't override Mr. Carson's legal rights to heat his home with a legal, properly installed, fully permitted heating appliance. The evidence shows a clear pattern of harassment. Mrs. Peterson has filed false complaints, misrepresented her authority, violated HOA bylaws, and now violated a court order. The judge looked back at Margaret. Mrs. Peterson, I'm granting a permanent restraining order. You are to have no contact with Mr. Carson, direct or indirect. You are not to post about him on social media. You are not to file any complaints about him with any government agency unless you have actual, documented evidence of a violation, and even then you must clear it with the court first. Do you understand? This is unfair, Margaret protested. He's the one polluting the neighborhood. Mrs. Peterson, every objective investigation has concluded otherwise. Your continued insistence otherwise, despite all evidence, suggests this is personal rather than principled. The restraining order is granted for 2 years. Additionally, for violating the temporary order, I'm fining you $500 and ordering you to pay Mr. Carson's attorney fees for this proceeding. Margaret looked shocked. I have to pay his attorney? Yes. Your conduct after being served with the temporary order necessitated additional legal action. Those costs are your responsibility. The attorney fee amount will be submitted by Mr. Carson's counsel and reviewed by the court. Jennifer submitted her fee invoice the next day, $3,200 covering the restraining order proceedings, the contempt motion, and correspondence related to the various false complaints. The judge approved the full amount. Margaret was ordered to pay within 30 days. I thought that was finally the end of the situation. The restraining order was in place. Margaret had faced real consequences, and surely she'd move on with her life. But 3 weeks later, something even stranger happened. I got a call from a Cedar Rapids police detective named Frank Morrison. Mr. Carson, I'm investigating an incident involving Margaret Peterson. I understand you have a restraining order against her. Yes, that's correct. What happened? Mrs. Peterson was arrested yesterday evening for trespassing and attempted arson at your property. She's currently in custody. I was stunned. What? I wasn't home yesterday evening. I was at my brother's house in Iowa City. I just got back this morning. Your neighbor, Patricia Adams, called 911 after she saw Mrs. Peterson in your yard acting suspiciously. Officers responded and found Mrs. Peterson attempting to start a fire in your woodpile. She had a gas can and matches. I sat down heavily. She was trying to burn my firewood. It appears she was trying to create evidence that you were burning prohibited materials or creating some kind of safety hazard. She had printed photographs that she said she was going to take showing toxic smoke from your property. Officers also found a statement she'd written that she apparently planned to submit to various authorities. This is insane, Mrs. Peterson is facing serious charges: criminal trespassing, attempted arson, and violation of a restraining order. The attempted arson is a Class C felony. This is serious. I needed a moment to process this. Margaret had apparently become so obsessed with proving I was wrong, and she was right that she'd crossed into criminal behavior. What do you need from me, detective? I need to get your statement about the ongoing dispute, verify that you didn't give her permission to be on your property, and document any damage to your woodpile or property. Detective Morrison came by that afternoon and took my statement. I walked him through the entire saga, from the initial complaint through the restraining order. He took photographs of my woodpile, where some of the wood showed evidence that someone had poured gasoline on it. Patricia Adams probably saved your property, Morrison said. If the fire had started and spread to your house, this could have been much worse. I need to thank her. She'll likely be called as a witness when this goes to trial. Her testimony will be important. Margaret's arrest made the local news. The story was brief but damning. Local woman arrested for attempted arson in HOA dispute. The article mentioned that the incident stemmed from a disagreement over wood burning and air quality. Several neighbors reached out to express their shock and support. Richard called to apologize on behalf of the HOA, even though Margaret's actions were entirely her own. Susan sent a text saying she'd always known Margaret was controlling but never imagined she'd become dangerous. I went next door to thank Patricia Adams. She invited me in and made coffee. I can't believe what she was trying to do, Patricia said. I was taking my dog out for his evening walk when I saw someone in your yard. It was dark, but I could tell they were doing something near your woodpile. When I got closer, I recognized Margaret's coat. She was pouring something from a gas can onto your wood. I'm so grateful you called the police. I didn't even hesitate. I called 911 and told them someone was about to commit arson. The police were there in maybe 5 minutes. Margaret was still there, trying to get the wood to light. She'd apparently underestimated how hard it is to burn seasoned hardwood, even with gasoline. What did she say when the police arrived? She tried to claim she was conducting a test to show that your wood was dangerous. She said something about proving it would create toxic smoke. The officers weren't buying it. They arrested her right there. Over the following weeks, the legal process moved forward. Margaret was formally charged with attempted arson in the second degree, criminal trespass, and violation of a protective order. Her attorney, Donald Kramer, withdrew from representing her after the arrest, apparently not wanting to be associated with such serious criminal charges. Margaret hired a criminal defense attorney and apparently tried to argue that she'd been acting in the community's interest and hadn't intended to actually damage my property. But the evidence was clear. She'd brought gasoline and matches to my property without permission, poured accelerant on my woodpile, and attempted to ignite it. Intent wasn't really ambiguous. In late April, Margaret accepted a plea deal. She pled guilty to attempted arson and violation of a protective order in exchange for the trespassing charge being dropped. The judge sentenced her to 2 years probation, 300 hours of community service, mandatory counseling, and restitution for my legal fees and property damage. The judge's statement at sentencing was pointed. Mrs. Peterson, Your obsession with being right about this issue led you to repeatedly violate legal boundaries and ultimately commit a serious crime. Mr. Carson was doing nothing illegal. Multiple professional investigations confirmed this. Yet you refused to accept reality and instead escalated your behavior to dangerous criminal conduct. You're fortunate that no one was harmed and no serious property damage occurred. I strongly encourage you to use your probation period to reflect on how you reached this point. Margaret sold her house that summer and moved out of Willow Creek. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved to Des Moines to be closer to her daughter. The house sold quickly. Apparently, the notoriety of the situation hadn't hurt property values too much. The HOA held elections for a new board in May. Richard remained as president, Susan stayed on as secretary, and a new neighbor named Thomas Wright joined as vice president. One of their first actions was to formally clarify the covenants regarding wood burning, explicitly stating that EPA-certified wood stoves and fireplaces were permitted as long as they were properly installed and maintained. Throughout the following winter, I continued burning wood to heat my home, just as I always had. The smoke rose from my chimney on cold evenings, drifting up into the Iowa sky without causing any problems for anyone. Patricia Adams and I became good friends after everything that happened. She joked that we'd bonded through chaos. She also got a dog and started walking it past my house regularly, though she assured me it wasn't to keep watch. She just liked the route. I did eventually upgrade Margaret's old furnace exhaust situation, not in her house but in mine. The whole ordeal had made me more conscious of air quality issues, and I had my own furnace inspected to make sure it was running efficiently. The inspector suggested a few minor updates that would reduce emissions and improve efficiency. I made the improvements, not because anyone forced me to, but because it was the right thing to do. The entire experience taught me several lessons. First, HOA board members with too much power and too little oversight can cause tremendous problems. Second, some people will double down on being wrong rather than admit they made a mistake, even when presented with objective evidence. Third, obsession and stubbornness can transform a simple disagreement into criminal behavior if left unchecked. But I also learned that most people are reasonable when given facts and treated with respect. The majority of my neighbors never had a problem with my wood burning, even during the height of Margaret's campaign against it. They understood that I was heating my home legally and responsibly. I still live in Willow Creek, still burn wood every winter, and still enjoy the warmth and cost savings it provides. My heating bills remain manageable, my house stays comfortable, and the wood stove continues to operate exactly as it was designed to. Margaret's crusade against my firewood smoke turned out to be the story of someone who couldn't accept being wrong, even when professional testing showed her gas furnace was polluting more than my wood stove ever did. She paid a heavy price for that stubbornness: loss of her HOA position, substantial legal fees, criminal charges, probation, and ultimately having to leave a neighborhood she'd lived in for years. Sometimes the smoke really does clear, and you can see things as they actually are. I wish Margaret had been able to see clearly before things escalated so far. But at least the situation eventually resolved, justice was served, and life in the neighborhood returned to normal. On cold winter evenings now, I still load oak and ash into my wood stove, watch the flames dance behind the glass door, and feel grateful for the warmth. The smoke rises from my chimney, well within EPA standards, bothering no one, heating my home exactly as it should. And somewhere in Des Moines, I hope Margaret finally found peace with the fact that sometimes being in charge doesn't mean you're right, and sometimes the answer isn't what you wanted it to be. The air quality report never lied. Her gas furnace really did pollute more than my wood stove, no matter how much she refused to believe it.